This is part 3 of our introduction to Girls on Fire, Gender, Culture, and Justice in YA Dystopia, specifically looking at the books that we'll be reading, or the books that are framing YA dystopia for this class and more generally. So this screen looks at a lot of popular mainstream YA dystopia with female protagonists. Certainly it is not everything out there, but a classic, Z is for Zachariah, about a young girl who is kind of caught amidst climate change and isolated and has to figure out how to make her way in the world. We have some kind of fairy tale themed like Matched and The Pledge and the Essence here. Enclave, that series, Under the Never Sky, the Delirium trilogy, the Dustlands trilogy for fans of the Hunger Games, Wither, Fever, and Sever. We've got the Shatter Me series. So a lot of different books, a lot that have common themes that we'll be looking at this semester. We're going to begin with Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and even though this book is not technically YA, it frames a lot of the YA dystopia elements that we'll look at, and it does feature a black girl protagonist. That'll be one of the things that we'll be looking at, as well as race and identity in these books. And I really think about Octavia Butler as being one of the mothers of YA dystopia. She wrote a lot of different kinds of science fiction, speculative fiction, dystopia kind of fiction, all sorts of different things in those books. So we'll be looking at Parable of the Sower, which is the first in a 2-book series. Octavia Butler writes about Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and she says the idea is to consider a possible future unaffected by parapsychological abilities such as telepathy or telekinesis, unaffected by alien intervention, unaffected by magic, and just to note that her other books do include a lot of those elements. But rather it's to look at where we are now, what we are doing now, and to consider where some of our current behaviors and unattended problems might take us. You might be shocked to find that these books are at least 20 years old, but that Octavia Butler had a pretty good vision of what the future might look like. So she looks at drugs and the effects of drugs on the children of drug addicts, the growing rich and poor gap, throwaway labor, I've got a typo there, sorry, and at our willingness to build and fill prisons, our reluctance to build and repair schools and libraries, and at our assault on the environment. So all of these pieces coming together to look at that YA dystopia, or that dystopia context. There's a diverse kind of tradition in adult dystopia or science fiction more generally, both contemporary and classic examples with female protagonists. So like I mentioned, Parable of the Talents is the second book in that series. We've got the classic Herland, which one of our readings will talk about that as a context. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is most famous for her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. We have this crazy Biting the Sun, which is actually 2 novels in one. And I say crazy just because it's super fun and kind of out there with the teens and the young adults having a particular culture. The classic Handmaid's Tale. We've got Marge Piercy, Woman on the Edge of Time, which is a little more science fiction. Cynthia Katahata's In the Heart of the Valley of Love, which is very much like a YA dystopia novel. Daughters of the North. So Daughters of the North and Biting the Sun are both British authors. We've got The Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk, which is a kind of an interesting kind of the future of hippies. 2 really recent novels that I put in this category, even though others might not. One of those being A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. It looks at this kind of connection across time and space. And California by Eden Lepucki, which was featured on Colbert Report, and made quite popular by that appearance. But it's quite an interesting book if you like dystopia. We also look at the Hunger Games trilogy, all 3 of those books, really what kind of started the fire of YA dystopia. It sets a lot of the standards and expectations, and there's a ton of work out there on this trilogy. We might look at Panem as an American dystopia. So Parable of the Talents describes what happens in Parable of the Sower, this moment of the pox, a chaotic period that was caused by accidentally coinciding climatic, economic, and sociological crises. The character says, I've watched poverty, hunger, and disease become inevitable for more and more people. And we see that being a situation in a lot of our YA dystopias. Here, just a little poster that I made with Katniss and a very popular, famous quote, "Your heart is a weapon the size of your fist. Keep fighting, keep loving." And a quote here from an article, a book chapter that takes that as kind of the starting point for this analysis of Suzanne Collins' trilogy and the Hunger Games specifically. Katniss and Peeta are both terribly scarred physically and psychologically by their experiences in the arenas and in war, but they're able to go on and survive the pain. Katniss Everdeen can survive her darkness because she understands the same truth that's expressed in the graffiti in Palestine. Her heart is a weapon, and the way to keep fighting against all the horror and cruelty of the world is to wield that weapon, to keep loving. We'll then move on to Divergent, which is another popular novel turned film. A lot of interesting aspects with personalities and cultural norms and the norms that are created around these factions that are here on the left. We'll also look at some interesting therapeutic applications, ways that we might help people understand themselves with these kinds of categories that we find in Divergent. We'll look at Legend, which I think is a really interesting text. It has a lot in common with The Hunger Games and Divergent, a lot of action. It is a little bit different than our other books because June Aparis, the narrator, or the female protagonist, shares that narration with Day through alternating chapters. June's a prodigy, a trained soldier for the Republic. Day is an outlaw. And one thing I want us to think about with this book is how race and ethnicity are considered and similar in different ways than in our previous texts. This is a movie in the works, so there's a lot of interesting stuff out there, including fan casting and fan art and memes and quotes and etc. So we see here the dystopia created for Legend. We have the Republic of America and the Colonies of America, so a different arrangement for that American dystopia in the future. We then move on to Birthmarked and Prized, and so again, two of the three books in this series, also a movie in the works for Birthmarked. So Birthmarked, we might, in addition to the other themes we're looking at, further consider walled communities, fighting for what's right, gendered work and expectations, value based on appearance, and being othered based upon physical imperfections, because our protagonist Gaia, as you can see from the picture here, does have a scar on her face which basically keeps her out of the enclave, out of that walled community. Prized takes us to a different kind of dystopia setting. We have an example of a matriarchy, so we might consider leadership, particularly women's leadership, politics, this idea of seeing through the fog and knowing who you are. So a lot of interesting stuff in these two books. We then move on to what I refer to as the othered girls of YA dystopia, and I think that Legend and Birthmarked fit into this category to some extent, but really looking at a few of these works in particular because these are books that have overt discussions of race via heritage, skin color, hair texture, outsider status, whatever else that might be. So our protagonists are girls of color, and that's an important aspect of the plot and the book itself. We might also look at this campaign, We Need More Diverse Books, as we look at these. So some of the othered girls in YA dystopia that we're not reading, The Immortal Rules, which is kind of is a vampire story, The Lost Girl. We have Tankborn, the Tankborn series, which is one of my favorites, The Chaos. We have the Partials series, which is a lot around kind of cyborg technology, The Way We Fall, and The Lives We Lost, which are the first two books in a three-book series that features an indigenous girl on an island and her struggles. We have Adaptation and Inheritance, which are both alien stories, and a couple of my favorite books, a lot of really interesting stuff around sexuality, bisexuality, and stuff like that. So a lot of really interesting things happening in YA dystopia books. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at Orleans. So again, in addition to some of those other themes, we're looking at the outer states versus Orleans, another wall in place. We've got the scientist who kind of plays that love interest role, but there's really not anything romantic between our narrator and protagonist Finn and Daniel the scientist, or the tourist as she calls him. We might look at tribal survival, individual survival. We've got the Delta fever and climate change, and also hope for the future. We'll then look at Shadows Cast by Stars, which is a really interesting book. Again, we have disease happening in this book with the plague. We also have this designation of some of our characters as others who are of Aboriginal descent and have these plague antibodies. We've got a different kind of wall in the boundary. We've got a lot of really interesting mixes of tradition and myth, the old way, a lot of power and spirit, and a lot of interesting aspects in terms of voice. And we have ancient traditions, real life ancient traditions that have these kind of future, somewhat magical applications. So a lot of interesting stuff to think about in this book. And then my personal favorite, The Summer Prince, which I think in some ways is kind of hard to even put in the YA category for a variety of reasons that we will discover. It is a quote-unquote teen book in most of the ways that it's listed. We see a lot of interesting cross-cultural connections. This is still an American dystopian context in Brazil of the future. We have a literally tiered class system and one of the few upper-class protagonists, also named June. So actually both of our Junes, June in Legend and June in The Summer Prince, are both more upper-class girls. We have a lot of highly developed technology, tech, and mods. We have sex and sexuality that defies the YA dystopia norms. And in this book, June is an artist, and at one point she says, "I live for spectacle, for the construction of emotional states and the evocation of suppressed feelings, and I am done with fairy tales. I want art, pure and clean and uncompromising." So we'll look at the ways in which June plays as a part of the system until she has to really look outside of that system for change. So that quote from that applies to Katniss, I think also very much applies to June and to this book. "Your heart is a weapon the size of your fist. Keep fighting, keep loving." So this book takes on a lot of really interesting dimensions of love. And again, June navigates that working within the system until she has no choice but to fight for something better. So these books and others make up this body of YA dystopia and The Girls on Fire. Each of these books are going to add to our understanding of YA dystopia literature and culture. And there's a variety of elements that they share we might look more closely at through our work, different patterns and comparisons, contrasts, themes and trends and complexities, different tropes, foils, contexts, understandings, so much richness here, and I really look forward to looking at these more closely with you this semester.